Welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Albert Cho. The UN General Assembly recently held its annual general debate, during which Taiwan's allies voiced support for Taiwan regarding Resolution 2758. However, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi claimed in his speech that Resolution 2758 has completely resolved the issue of representation for all of China, including Taiwan, in the UN. Additionally, during the UN General Assembly, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Wang Yi to prepare for the upcoming Biden-Xi phone call. How does the Taiwan question affect U.S.-China relations? Joining us today are Cai Rongxiang, National Zhongzhen University Department of Political Science professor, and Lev Nachman, National Taiwan University Graduate Institute of National Development Assistant Professor. A very warm welcome to both on the show.
Thank you.
First, let's take a look at Wang Yi's remarks during the UN General Assembly debates.
这一决议彻底解决了包括台湾在内全中国在联合国的代表权问题，明确不存在两个中国，不存在一中一台。
So Lev, first of all, what's your comments on the current situation when Wang Yi came out and said that the UN the resolution 2758 has resolved the issue of the representation of China in UN, including Taiwan?
So this has been a growing narrative that they've been using this specific resolution to argue that there's no discussion to be had about Taiwan. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, if you read the resolution, that's not really true. And there's been more and more calls to sort of readdress just how important this resolution is in responding to Taiwan's status. Now, even though this is still an ongoing debate, there's been recent reports from scholars who study Taiwan, like Bonnie Glaser and Jacques Delisle, that talk about the meaning of this resolution, how China's trying to use it to marginalize Taiwan. And I think this is starting to really get back to China and how they're starting to feel about this resolution.
Mm-hmm. Professor Cai, do you think that there's an increasing voice in the international society for Taiwan, especially regarding its de facto independence, and tend to view the resolution in a sense that it does not really explain the current status of Taiwan, but rather it was referred to the Chiang Kai-shek regime back in the 1970s when the regime was kicked out of the UN at that time.
If you see the text of 2758 resolution, you couldn't find a word Taiwan. Even for Chinese former Premier Zhou Enlai, he said it's impossible to put in the clause concerning the status of Taiwan in the 2758 resolution. And the thing is that, so the status of Taiwan is left hanging in the air. So for U.S. positions on this, because I heard some U.S. officials say China falsely claimed 2758 resolution resolved the Taiwan issue and has been pushing against an open door. Because for U.S., 2758 did not endorse one China principle and no bearing on countries to develop diplomatic relationships with Taiwan. And 2758 is not a UN institutional position on Taiwan. And finally, 2758 doesn't exclude Taiwan to participate in international fora of some UN organizations. So that's very, very important. We could not allow China to dictate those terms in UN, especially UN is not a place to resolve some country can recognize another country, that kind of stuff. It's not a forum to deal with that kind of problem. Yeah.
Well, there is a kind of question, extended from both of your answers that in the past, as a Taiwanese, we all are familiar with this phenomenon where a lot of people argue there should be a de jure, which is legal independence of Taiwan. But that's probably from within the Taiwanese society. But do you guys agree with the notion that nowadays we see more and more those kind of voices either arguing that there's a disconnection between the UN 2758 resolution and the status of Taiwan from the international society? So does that imply that there are increasing room for Taiwan to walk in that direction? I mean, legal independence there.
So I think it's first important to clarify that we have so much public opinion data on how Taiwanese people feel about the question of Taiwan's status, which is that people in Taiwan want the status quo, which is to maintain de facto independence, not to pursue de jure independence. We know that if they wanted to pursue de jure independence, we would see that reflected in the just unending amount of public opinion data that we have on this question.
Okay.
So I think it's first worth establishing that what Taiwanese people want isn't necessarily to resolve this question of Taiwan's status in the UN, but rather just to be able to have a presence at the UN. I think a lot of the international calls for Taiwan's allowance to participate in these kinds of international organizations reflect that recognition that what people in Taiwan want is just a voice in these kinds of international organizations. It's not necessarily an international referendum on trying to decide Taiwan's status. As my colleague very nicely put, that's not what the UN is for. The UN is more about trying to create a space for countries around the world to be able to engage in meaningful dialogue about important international geopolitical issues.
But could you argue, could you see the UN is sort of like an occasion where it's a power politics, manifest in there, instead of the justice and even a open discussion about the status of Taiwan? Because I ask many scholars, they say that even the votes in UN, especially in the assembly, could be bought. So what's your comment on this?
Of course, China is trying to perform their territorial claim over Taiwan in the UN. When I see Wang Yi making these kinds of statements, knowing that, as again my colleague nicely put, Taiwan isn't even mentioned in this resolution, so how could it possibly have the final word on Taiwan? This is much more about China trying to create a context for itself to make these kinds of claims. And the appropriate response is to remember that that's not the UN's role, and it doesn't matter what he says in the UN's context. That does not give China the space to sort of resolve these sort of territorial disputes. Instead, what I think the focus should be on is trying to think of ways that we can move past just what Wang Yi is trying to say and create more space for Taiwan's ability to participate. Because we know that historically, sometimes the PRC does not put up this sort of dogmatic zero-sum fight against blocking Taiwan's participation. Under the KMT administration, there was some amount of participatory observational status given to Taiwan, sometimes so long as, when certain powers in Taiwan are elected. But of course, because we are currently in a DPP administration, then the PRC sort of blocks any attempt by Taiwan to participate in any sort of meaningful way.
But will you say that when you meant Pen Blue was in power, when President Ma Ying-jeou, when he was in the office, there will be more room allowed by PRC and even CCP for Taiwan to join the international society. Do you think that approach is a better way to do for Taiwan?
I think it's worth noting it's not that the UN becomes more open to it, it's only that the PRC is somehow more open to it. And this is really the role that international community needs to play, is to not necessarily allow the PRC to define exclusively when Taiwan is and is not allowed to have some low-level meaningful participation in the UN.
Professor Tsai,
Yes.
At the UN General Assembly, Taiwan's allies, including Eswatini, along with non-allies, voiced their support for Taiwan. So did these actions provide Taiwan with substantial attention?
Yes, we need to thank Taiwan's allies for speaking for Taiwan in the UN, because if the UN accepts one China principle, the serious consequence is this. If China try to use threat or maybe threats of force or coercive actions to get Taiwan back, it would be lawful and legitimate in the context of a civil war. So any countries, including the US, if US try to intervene in the war of Taiwan's trade, that would be unlawful. So Taiwan needs the collective efforts, like Professor Neckerman said, like-minded democratic allies, they have to push back to China's absurd assertion and garner sympathy to Taiwan's international plight. It's very, very important because we only have 12 diplomatic countries left. So we should do something more, but the thing is that China keep, squeeze our space internationally. That's the thing. And then they try to expand the notion of Taiwan independence. Wang Yi say, 2 Chinas, 1 Taiwan, 1 China. They all are called as Taiwan independence. This is very, very serious. So we need to expand our international space and then try to do more. Okay, this is the only thing we can deter China in this way.
We saw Blinken and Wang Yi met on the sidelines of UN General Assembly, marking their 4th meeting this year. They talked over an hour, according to CCTV. Wang Yi stated that the U.S. can't treat China with two faces, as Professor Tsai mentioned, simultaneously suppressing China while seeking cooperation. Blinken actually countered that after the meeting, asserting while China claims to want peace, it allows Chinese companies to supply weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine. This meeting also served as a warm-up for the upcoming conversation between Biden and Xi. So the 4 meetings between Blinken and Wang Yi this year show increasing intensity in their dialogue. Does this indicate the beginning of change in U.S.-China relations, Professor Nachman?
I think this is a really important moment where we're creating more floor to stand on. I think it's no secret that the U.S.-China relationship has been rocky for a number of years now. And the fact that Wang Yi and Antony Blinken are able to have dialogue is a good thing. It's good for Taiwan, it's good for the United States, and it's good for China, because without dialogue, that leads to misunderstanding and miscommunication.
The U.S. presidential election, when it is approaching, within 30 days, both Trump and Harris seem to have adopted an anti-China stance, even though we saw that Trump this year maybe is equally unfriendly to Taiwan. So what is your take on this? How do you see China's attitudes influencing the election dynamics in the United States?
So I think, anti-China is perhaps not what I would use to describe a lot of the politics. I think it's much more, hawkish is probably the better word, because anti-China infers that they're actively trying to fight against China. And I think it's more about trying to find a balance of how do we compete against China while also finding room to cooperate. Because neither party, I think, within the establishment of the parties at least, are trying to go just a complete anti-China direction. But the challenge, of course, is both have to address the growing combative relationship that we've had with the PRC for the last number of years. And I think what the Harris campaign has been trying to do is to try to, at the very least, signal it's going to follow into a lot of Biden's footsteps with, competing against the PRC while also trying to slowly improve the relationship. As to Donald Trump's campaign, your guess is as good as mine as to what he will actually say or do if reelected, because we've seen a lot of back and forth between his campaign about whether or not he is supportive of Taiwan or not supportive of Taiwan. So I think we're all very eager to see the results of the election, just so we can even know what to even expect in the coming years.
Okay, so it's predictable on the parts of Trump. Professor Tsai, so the same question for you is that there has been 4 meetings between Blinken and Wang, right? This year. So do you see any kind of rapprochement between the United States and China in the near future, especially in the aftermath of the U.S. presidential election?
Maybe they try to shake hands, right, in international occasions. They try to have some telephone communication. But the thing is that under the scenes, there are a lot of competitions going on. So I would say this, the era of constructive engagement is over, okay? So they need to compete on many fronts, okay, such as military stuff, such as technology stuff. So for China, it's a very rock and a hard place for China to choose which candidate will be the president, because if Trump were re-elected, and he will pursue a tougher China position, especially he will tariff on China's goods exporting to the U.S. If Harris won the presidency, and she will follow suit, like Professor Nachman said, she will follow suit President Biden's approach, such as a tech war with China. So either way, it's not gonna get China off the hook. So the thing is that it's better for China not to bet on any candidate right now. They just keep an eye on the ball and then see what happens, because it's just 1 month away, okay? You don't choose sides, okay, before the final result, okay?
Okay, Xi Jinping has recently mentioned Taiwan multiple times at the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference and the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. he declared a firm opposition to Taiwan independence, which is not surprising, and separatist activities stating that Taiwan is a sacred territory for China. So what signal does this send? Is it a response to the recent military vessels from Japan and other countries crossing the Taiwan Strait? Nachman?
I don't know that it's inherently a response to one particular event, and more just very in line with what we know Xi Jinping will say about Taiwan. I think, especially in recent years, any opportunity that he has to sort of emphasize the territorial claims that the PRC makes over Taiwan, he's going to re-emphasize those. And given that we are sort of at this cross point in the U.S.-China relationship, I think it's more likely he's going to emphasize that claim not just for his own domestic audience, but also for an international audience as time goes on.
Okay, Professor Tsai?
Yeah, the thing is that he tried to use that kind of language, all right? The unification of the country is a historical necessity for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So he tried to appeal to national sentiment to Taiwan and also try to sell one country, two system framework to Taiwan. But there's no market of one country, two system in Taiwan because you see the case in Hong Kong. But the recent military vessels sailing through the Taiwan Strait demonstrate one thing. The Taiwan Strait is a high sea. It's not internal waters claimed by China. So we try to seek autonomous democratic state rather than pursuing de jure independence. Because a lot of people in Taiwan, they maybe like 7 or 80% of people supporting for maintaining status quo. But for China, if you still Taiwan issue like two Chinas, right? One China, one Taiwan, they are all the same, okay? This is the typical part for us to be able to live in a democratic country, okay?
Okay, in addition, The Economist mentioned that the People's Liberation Army, PLA, has been applying a so-called anaconda strategy to pressure Taiwan since the Lai administration took office. The PLA is ready to blockade Taiwan anytime if they wish. Under what condition, Professor Nachman, do you think that the PLA would be likely to attack Taiwan?
So I think that, first of all, this isn't so much a new strategy as much as it's a strategy we've seen in development for a number of years now, with an increased number of both the quantity and the quality of these sort of incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. As to under what conditions would we actually see military conflict, I think it's a matter of very specific red lines being crossed. So specifically, Taiwan unilaterally declaring de jure independence, which is not going to happen in the near future, or if the world suddenly starts formally recognizing Taiwan as a de jure independent country, which is also not likely to happen in the future. I think it's important to keep in mind that the very specific red lines that we know would trigger a conflict are very unlikely to happen. And instead, it's much more likely that if we do see a conflict in the short term, it's likely due to human error, which is a very small percentage chance. To put differently, I don't think we're necessarily going to see conflict in the short term.
Okay, Professor Tsai.
Yeah, because in China's anti-secession law, it says, okay, one thing, the possibility for peaceful reunification should be completely exhausted. So this is the one condition they can have a reason for casus belli to unify Taiwan. But like you're saying, right, they try to use anaconda strategy. But I would say this, okay, in the animal world, the harpy eagle is the predator of anacondas. So that means when China tries to gobble Taiwan up, the U.S. will swoop in and deter China and protect Taiwan. Okay, that's my energy.
Okay, at the same time, the Biden administration approved a $567 million military aid package for Taiwan in late September, marking the highest amount of military assistance to Taiwan under the president's authority. So what message is the White House trying to send to Beijing, especially, when Biden is going to step down and he's going to become a part of history? And, how are we going to remember Biden when he's in office, treating Taiwan? Professor Nachman.
I don't think this is any new signal. This is really just following well-established practices by the United States of selling military arms of a defensive nature to Taiwan, which is part of what governs the policies around the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. Now, of course, every single package that the United States sells to Taiwan upsets the PRC. And we're likely going to see the exact same kind of reaction from the PRC as we do every other time the U.S. approves this kind of arms sale. I don't know that there's inherently a worse version of this. It's just sort of the exact same response that we're going to get as every other time.
Okay, Professor Tsai, a follow-up quick for you is that DW finds that Biden's decision to approve the largest military aid package for Taiwan in history coincides with the final stretch before the U.S. presidential election. Like what I asked the previous question, they say that by accelerating the transfer of defense resources to Taiwan, Biden aims to mitigate risks in case former President Trump returns to the White House and reverses Washington's pro-Taiwan stance. So how do you assess the Biden administration's action to protect Taiwan?
Yeah, President Biden has clearly stated 5 times the U.S. will defend Taiwan in the event of China's unprovoked attack. So that means he tried to say this is the time, the era of strategic ambiguity is somehow gone. We need to, have another policy like strategic clarity, because it's very, very important and for Biden. But he's not Trump's approach, because Trump tried to say, we should deal with this issue, just U.S. and Taiwan. But for Biden, it's a different strategy. He tried to use coalition, right? Try to persuade Japan, the Philippines, come together and then deter China. So that's his legacy. Even maybe 1 month later, Harris got elected, then she will pursue the same policy or same approach like Biden did.
Well, this Biden approach is still, is particularly striking because it is in contrast to the Trump recent comment that Taiwan's defense budget should account for 10% of Taiwan's GDP. So, Professor Nachman, what's your take on this?
I think it reflects a lack of understanding of Taiwan's context within the world, and it reflects a lack of understanding of the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. I think a number of former President Trump's comments on Taiwan in recent times, whether it's been, comments about Taiwan needs to be spending more for America's support, or, these comments about, Taiwan stealing America's semiconductor industry, reflect sort of a misunderstanding of where the U.S.-Taiwan relationship currently stands.
But the current Taiwan defense budget is not even up to 3%. You think about Israel, it's 4.5%. In the Cold War, back in the States, it was 5 to 10%. Do you think that now the current criteria is still not good enough?
It's certainly not enough, but to make this sort of 10% claim, I think is sort of a ad hominem approach to critiquing Taiwan, as opposed to actually offering a productive number or a reasonable set of expectations. Donald Trump saying they should be spending 10% of their GDP, I don't actually think is a productive way for a presidential candidate to be addressing Taiwan.
Professor Tsai, quick response.
Yeah, it's kind of like a hyperbole, right? And then we should go into that direction. We should expand more, right? But it's not gonna get into like 10%. You look at the spending in U.S., only 5%. Right? How can you ask Taiwan to expand to 10%? Of course, we should expand more. That's fine. We should spend more military stuff, especially in terms of the GDP. But the thing is that we should do it step by step. Okay? We cannot just let's have 10%. It's not doable.
Okay. Not to mention that there's a procrastination of the the military package sold to Taiwan. We already paid for that, but still the process is still delayed. Okay, Voice of America reported that Biden and Xi Jinping plan to hold a phone call in the coming days. Biden approved a military aid package for Taiwan just before the call, while Xi Jinping reiterated that Taiwan is China's sacred territory in his public statements. What are the implications behind their actions? On the one hand, still competition, especially regarding Taiwan. On the other, seemingly there is a cooperation, and getting more and more we see that kind of phenomenon. Professor Nachman?
I think this is the future of the U.S.-China relationship, where the United States tries its best to articulate to China that we're going to keep assisting and defending Taiwan, but that doesn't have to come at the expense of a productive relationship with the PRC. I think we often view these things as zero-sum, where if you do one, then you take away from the other.
But it is not zero-sum,
It is not zero-sum. We should not approach this triangular relationship as zero-sum.
Professor Tsai?
Yeah, the thing is that diplomacy often involves two scripts. One is like handshaking and telephone communications, but the other is behind the scenes actions. So in the context of U.S.-China competition, the Taiwan issue is of course interest for China. But for U.S., it's a matter of national interest and it's a democratic defense. If China continue crosses red lines, such as conducting military flights, naval warships, circumnavigating around Taiwan or crossing the medium line of the Taiwan Strait, the U.S. must continue arms sales to Taiwan and to arm to the teeth to Taiwan, because it's the only way which can deter China try to invade Taiwan.
The current Lai Ching administration, do you guys think that he's doing well in terms of maintain the stability in the cross-strait relations, especially with the relationship with the United States? Professor Nachman.
I think, first of all, it's important to note that there's really very little policy space that President Lai can really move within. Even right now, we see that the defense budget is currently locked up in the legislative UN debate and that it hasn't been passed yet. So I think, whether or not there's room for him to do more is very much limited by some kind of domestic constraints.
Professor Tsai?
Yeah, I don't think PRC will do something different because it worked before, because they tried to ally with some, KMT members, because this is their strategy: divide and rule, right? So it will be have a cold peace between Taiwan and China before China's invasion.
Professor Tsai, Professor Nachman, thank you for your great insights. Like our show, subscribe to Taiwan Talks. See you soon.